Today we're here with Tessa Reynolds and of course me, the instructor, Mr. Beer. We are here to go over the table saw safety. Alright, again we have our PowerPoint along with this video in order to learn the safety of this saw. Again, you can check out those both online. Alright, I'm just going to go over here and we'll flip through this PowerPoint as we go through the safety. And this was again produced by Tessa, so we go through, and of course we have the template where we have the parts listed first, right? So we're going to go through the parts. Now, nice thing here is Tessa actually has had the table saw before, so she should be and is fairly and really familiar with the parts. So again, I won't have to actually step in place here. She'll just be able to run us right through these. And we're actually going to start, we decide, with the base, right? Okay, so we're going to start at the base. So she's going to point out the base. Yep. Okay, so the base of the table saw there, again, holds the main part of the table saw up. And then, of course, below the base there, we actually have a dust collection system, right? Yep, right there. And it goes up to the gate up high, and we've seen that with the other equipment in order to open that up and collect the dust. Okay. All right, right above that we have, and you want to get down there, just stay down there. There is a hand wheel. You guys see that there? There's a hand wheel in front. That hand wheel there allows us to move the blade, the circular blade of the table saw, up and down. Right. The circular blade is a 10-inch blade for this table saw. And most table saws are. That's a pretty standard size blade. And that also allows us to do about a 3.5-inch cut with our table saw. So we can go 3.5 inches deep. Alright, we move to the right-hand side of that hand wheel. So we go around the right-hand side, and there's another hand wheel that kind of looks exactly the same. Now that one there will allow our blade to move like a bevel. Alright, and the bevel we talked about with the miter saw, so we should be familiar with that, right guys? Okay. Right above that we have the on-off switch, again located right out front. Now that location there is okay. The issue with that location is it's actually kind of down and kind of in line almost with the blade itself. So we are going to go through with the safety on how to avoid an issue with that stop switch there. Nice thing is it is kind of out front compared to the other table saw, so it is slightly safer, but again not the most ideal spot. But they do build it there, and that's the way we'll keep it. Okay. Above that we have the fence. We have a rip fence. There we go. Okay, and that slides on a nice rail there with a measuring device on it. So you want to zoom in on that with the camera a little bit. Point out the measuring device there, Tess. Thank you. Now, not always do I trust that measuring device there. I always double check with a tape measure for your measurement of the width of cut that you're going to make. Okay. All right, to the left of that, we also have another gauge that's called the miter gauge. There we go. Okay, the miter gauge. And we'll talk here again what cuts we can actually make with all this, so our miter gauge. Then below the miter gauge and the rip fence, we actually have the table of the table saw. Okay, so yep, our table. Nice flat surface. Alright, allows us to be able to feed that board to the saw. Right by the blade, and Tessa's going to kind of sort of point to the blade here. Don't actually touch the blade there, Tessa. There we go. It's right there in the center. And we actually have a throat plate, what they call a throat plate. Okay, so point to the throat plate. There we go. Okay, that is removable, and the reason that's removable is so that we can take the blade out of that saw, okay, and allow us to put a different type of blade in there, like a dado head, or even just to repair this blade and put a new one in. Okay, but of course we're going to do what, guys, before we actually cut on this table saw, we're going to check the board for? What? Knots and or, what was the other thing we talked about with the joiner? Yeah, you're the joiner safety guy. Metal, right? Okay, we're checking over for metal or any of that stuff. Then we should never have an issue with the blade. The blade that's in this saw is a carbide tooth blade, kind of like the one that was in the miter saw. So we can make rip cuts, cross cuts, bevel cuts, compound bevel cuts. We can make all those cuts, no problem. Okay? Alright, back behind the throat plate there, we do have our guard. Now the guard is the actual most important piece of this saw. We want to make sure that that is in place at all times. when we make a cut. Now, once in a great while, if we have the rip fence close enough that we got to take a little bitty sliver off of the board, it may not be possible for us to have that guard in place. If it's not, you guys need to talk to me, and I'll make sure I'm there with you in the table saw in order to make our cut safe. All right? Attached to the guard, thank you. Attached to the guard is the anti-kickback paws. There we go. The anti-kickback paws there. Okay, see how they kind of spring out of the way? What happens is the board goes through the saw. Those things come down and they actually grip into the board. Yep, just like Tessa's showing there, they'll grip. And they'll keep from having a kickback happen. All right? Kickback happens if the blade binds and the board wants to come backwards at us. All right? We want to try to avoid that at all costs. So anti-kickback paws. Again, we definitely want those to make sure they're working. If not, make sure you talk to me about it. Okay, on the back side of the saw, where Tessa's at there, around the back side there, there is an electric motor that runs this table saw. Okay, so the electric motor, and it's belt driven. So again, because it's belt driven, we want to make sure that we're not forcing the saw as we cut. Okay? All right. I think we've covered all the parts, right, Tessa? Should we set to go? Excellent. Okay, you guys can come back forward. Okay. All right, the table saw is a cutting machine with a fixed horizon table and an adjustable blade, used for ripping and cross-cutting boards. All right, so hold the board up again, Tessa. We did this for the miter saw, but we'll do it again. Face it right in front of you. There we go. Okay, ripping goes lengthwise with the grain. All right? Cross-cutting goes across the blade, or the board, excuse me, goes across the board or across the grain. All right? A bevel cut, again, goes angular with the grain or across the grain. All right? And then a miter cut goes angular across the grain. So those are the cuts we'll be able to do. Now, we talked about those cuts with the miter saw, and the only one we couldn't do was what, guys? Do you remember? What was the only cut there that we talked about that we can't do? What was the one we just put in? A rip cut, right? Remember we said the only cut that thing can't do is a rip cut. Now we can actually do that with this saw. Okay? The cross cuts are not always ideal for this type of procedure. Most cuts we're going to do are going to be rip cuts. All right? Because we have the miter saw, we can go there and do our cross cuts. Okay? Thank you, Tessa. That's not the overly fast transition. It's nice though. All right, table saw safety. Again, the most key thing is to wear what? Safety glasses. Good. We want to make sure we're wearing our safety glasses at all times. If the cutting operation is dusty, we can wear a dust mask. We do have some of those here, so if you guys are more comfortable with that, make sure you ask. And this one here does tend to be pretty dusty because it is a wire saw blade, so it takes quite a bit of material and leaves it sawdust. Okay. Do not wear gloves while using the table saw. Again, none of the equipment in here want to wear any gloves because it could get caught and cause an issue. Okay, avoid long sleeves, dangling jewelry, any of that type of stuff, because this is a circular running device, and of course that stuff can get wrapped up inside of it, and that can be a major issue also. Okay. Yep. Yeah, if we're wearing a sweatshirt, which we do this time of year, definitely take those and tuck them in, which is a really good thing. Long hair could be tied back too, right? Okay, so we could make sure all that happens. All right, and of course we talked about shoes with the joiner, right? We want to make sure we have a good pair of shoes on. Wear non-slip footwear, which is what we just brought up here, so covered that before we even got to it. All right. Okay, for the table saw safety in the operation. All right, first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we use a push stick or sometimes a push block, but typically a push stick. You got that? Tessa's going to show you where that's at again, just in case we didn't see it with the joiner. So they're located right up there. Good. Just one's fine. Okay, so our push stick. The reason we're going to use that is because we want to keep that, how many inch margin? 4-inch margin, right guys? The only machine that's not the same for is the bandsaw, which we went over yesterday, right? Okay, so we want to make sure we're keeping that 4-inch safety. If we're within the blade 4 inches, we want to make sure we're using that push stick. Okay, excellent. All right, use a stop block when you cross-cut short lengths. All right, if we're cutting short lengths, a stop block is a little device that'll be clamped to the table, and it actually pushes the block against the fence. Okay, at this given point in time, I'm not going to show that operation because it does take time to set it up. But if we need to cut that, I'll show that safety at that point. Okay, so push block or a stop block. Position your body. The position of your body is really key on the table saw. Okay, majority of kickbacks do happen on the table saw. Believe it or not, they can even happen to me as the instructor, and they have. All right. We want to obviously avoid them at all costs. But again, this is one of the saws where it does happen the most, and hopefully it's not inevitable that's going to happen, but it's a possibility. All right. So we want to make sure, obviously, our body's not positioned in a spot where it could get the kickback from the table saw. This saw will also throw the board the hardest out of all the equipment. Okay. So if it does bind and it does throw it, again, we want to make sure we're out of the way. We don't take that force to our body, okay? Again, the position of our body also is key for the safety guard, in that we have that down. Usually what happens is when the board kickbacks, okay, it usually comes back across the blade, and when it comes back across the blade, it usually tends to take your hands with it, okay? So that is one of the biggest reasons we definitely want this guard in place, because this will stop your hands from going to that blade. Alright? Okay, so, position of our body, we definitely want to be on the, stand there, left of the blade, or the, good, right of the blade. Either way, we definitely do not want to be directly behind the blade. Alright? Usually if we're to the right of the blade, we want to try to be to the right of the fence even. Okay, there we go. So we want to try to stand right about there. Tessa's in a good spot right there. Yep. Okay, because our board is going to be between the blade and the fence, we're making a rip cut. And typically, this is the piece that goes, if it binds. Alright, so a little bit off to the side is perfect. Now, what will happen is, again, body position. What will happen is when we cut here, a little piece of board will hang off to the left-hand side of the blade. Alright? What do we talk about with the stop switch? Where's it at?
Right there. So you have to like go down and then...
Okay, good. She remembers the safety. Alright? The stop switch is here off to the left. If our little board is hanging out right here, right next to that blade, possibility of kickback, right? Like we were just talking. Alright, so what Tessa's going to want to do is kneel down at her knees. There we go. And she's going to reach across underneath the table saw and hit the stop button. Okay, if she was to be standing up, again, body position, and she leaned over, look where her head's going. Right in a major issue spot, right? So it's best to kneel down and reach across. Then her head's out of the way, and it'd be worse to take it in the head than it would anywhere else. So definitely don't bend over so your head's in the way. Alright, body position. Good, thank you. A little bit more about the body position that I kind of forgot there. Reaching across the blade, never reach over across the blade. Right, that's definitely a major key safety thing. The height of the blade. Okay, so Tessa's going to go ahead and she's going to flip the guard up out of the way. Perfect. And then she's going to take our board. I'm going to move this stuff out of the way for her. Okay, and she already knows how to set this up. She's going to set the board right next to the blade. Okay? And then she's going to wheel that hand wheel in front of the saw blade, or in front of the saw, excuse me. And she's going to wheel the blade up. Now, when she's wheeling the blade up, she wants to make sure that the blade is approximately 1/8 to 1/4. Alright, this saw does wheel a little bit hard. Okay, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 above the top surface of the board. That's why she's laying the board right next to the saw blade. Okay? Yep, and that's about a half of a tooth of the saw blade itself. And this is a carbide tooth on here. Alright, so she's about a half of a tooth high. Now there's a slight bit of controversy over that. Okay, I believe in this method. That's why I had her put the 1/4 of an inch in her PowerPoint. Okay, the reason I believe this process is because the tooth of the saw blade actually stays in the board itself. Okay, and it makes a cleaner cut. The controversy is the tooth is staying in the board is a possibility of creating greater kickback. Because it actually never does come out of the board and then push back down on the board to force it towards the table. Okay? I was taught in college that you teach either or, but stick to either or, right? So we're going to stick to the simple fact that the tooth is going to stay in the board to make us a cleaner cut. We're just going to make sure that we stand in the correct spot while we're cutting. Alright? So about that 1/8 to 1/4 above, and we're set to make a cut. Okay? Alright. Move back over this way. Did you get in there and zoom in on that so we can see it? Just go on this side of it so we can see the height of that. Did you guys able to see good enough? Okay.
Sometimes you measure it too, if you don't measure it.
Yeah, you could measure it too. Thank you. If you're going to use a tape measure or a yardstick, whichever one it is. Alright. A little bit of the body position again, making sure our feet are firmly against the floor. That's good. Okay, we're going to move on here. Okay, carrying on the conversation. I think we talked about that yesterday with the bandsaw, correct? Okay, we don't want to carry on a conversation with somebody and or yelling across the room at somebody while we're standing there operating it. Alright, we just keep to ourselves. Alright, make sure we're following the safety and do our operation. Okay, best way to do it. Have your conversation before you actually make the cut. Okay, about the safety, about how the cut's going to happen, and so on and so forth. Alright. Don't reach behind the blade, again, basically over the blade, and I just covered that a little bit ago, so we definitely want to make sure that doesn't happen. Do not leave the saw until it comes to a complete stop. Again, we talked about that with the miter saw a little bit. That one stops pretty fast, but definitely the joiner, because that sits there and runs for a long time afterward. Okay, definitely the bandsaw, that sits there and runs a while afterward. This is the same thing. It does not have a brake on the motor, so it tends to sit there and run a while. Just stay here with the saw until it comes to a complete stop. Okay, then we're safe to then leave it. Now, another thing with the safety on the complete stop is when we leave this table saw, right, Tessa, we want to make sure we do what with that blade?
Put it down.
All the way down, right? I want that blade all the way down. The reason I want that blade all the way down is if somebody does walk by here and trips on something, it's a possibility because we have a lot of stuff around here. Okay, we keep it clean, but it's a possibility. They don't fall and they don't run their hand into that blade, even if it's not turning. Okay, because that can still cut you that way too. Right, so definitely make sure that's down and below the table before we leave the saw. Alright. Always disconnect the power if we're going to make any adjustments, and the power actually just plugs in right up there. Alright, again called what energy? Zero state energy, so we make sure we unplug that. The biggest one is if we're going to change out a blade. Definitely unplug. Alright, so that we can change that blade with no issues. And the simple fact that there could be some energy there. Make sure the blades stop turning and then we can leave the saw, which we just talked about. Okay. Transition's cool. So, there you go. After any adjustment, make sure that the blade is free of turning, or make sure it's free and then it turns. Okay. The saws in here are pretty well kept, so it shouldn't be an issue that they can't spin. Okay, but if you, for some odd reason, feel that you want to definitely check that blade, again, zero state energy, and then you can check to make sure it spins freely. Ensure that the guides are in the correct position. Now, that's good. I like that Tessa put this in here. The reason we want to make sure that that guard's in the right position is actually if we do flip that down, I'm going to move the board out of the way. Okay, it can actually tend to go right or left. Go ahead and push it a little bit right or left. Okay, you see that? We want to make sure that it's down over top of the blade. So basically what we don't want to do is we don't want to start the saw and then put that blade, that guard down. Because it could run into that saw blade and then we have plastic all over the place and we busted the machine. Okay, so always make sure it's in a down position before we actually turn the equipment on. Okay? Alright. Make make sure the rip fence is parallel. Typically it always stays parallel, but if you want to measure it, I'll actually show you here in just a minute how you measure that. We talked about the there's 3 measuring things we want to do. Okay, we're probably just about through this, I would assume. Then we can talk a little bit about what's not in here. Check the throat plate, which we just did. Actually, checking the throat plate's a good thing. Go ahead and wheel that guard up again. The guard. There we go. Okay. And over here, Tessa had that square that we had with the joiner. And she can check this throat plate. All right. The throat plate should be flush with the top surface of the table. Yep. And she can lay that on there, and if she doesn't see any light below it, okay, that means our throat plate is adjusted level. If it's not adjusted level, talk to me. Actually, what you do is you take these 4 screws and you turn those up or down, and it'll adjust that throat plate nice and level. Okay. Between the 2 saws that we have in here, we do have a 0 clearance throat plate and then a bevel throat plate. All right. I should have grabbed the 0 clearance. Just go right back here. We'll grab one. All right. A 0 clearance throat plate actually has a seam in it that is just large enough for the blade. Alright, so it's just large enough. And what that does is allows us to make a cleaner cut. So we actually want to use this type of throat plate. At some point I have to actually order new ones, which we will. This one here, we use this saw a lot, so there we go. Alright, this one here has a larger opening so we can take the saw blade and turn it at a bevel. So a larger opening. So there's a few different style throat plates. Now, this throat plate will not switch to that saw as this saw to that saw. Okay, they're different size throat plates. It's just a different size opening in the upper part of the saw is all it is. But they won't cross over. All right, so you have specific ones for this one, specific ones for that. And they're always installed, so it shouldn't be an issue. Alright. Let's see. Throat plate, 0 clearance. Oh, yeah, the measuring of the throat plate. So we're set there. Okay. Freehand cuts. Definitely never ever make freehand cuts. Yesterday with the bandsaw, we talked most of our cuts are going to be freehand. With this thing here, we definitely either have to use the rip fence or, in other cases, the miter gauge. Alright. One key safety thing is we never ever use this and that together. Alright? If you use the miter gauge and the rip fence together, that's poison for catastrophe. Right? What it does is it pushes on this side and pushes on that side, pinching the blade, allowing what to happen. Kick back. Okay? So never ever use these together. You can use them individually, but definitely not together. Alright? Okay? Let's see. Okay. The last one she had there is the work as we're cutting. And you're going to see when she demonstrates it. As we're cutting the board, she will make sure that she pushes the board all the way through the blade. Okay? We do not want to stop short of the blade because, again, that could be the poison and away goes the board, right? We always keep hold of the board, we push it all the way through the blade. Alright. Let's see. Losing grip on the piece, again, we make sure we hold it all the way through. Check that the stock has no nails or metal. We talked about that a little bit earlier. We're probably pretty close to measuring here. Do not use the fence and miter gauge together. I should have waited. Circuit tape saw should be guarded with the hood and included covers. Okay, so we talked about the guards. Excellent. Fence must be adjusted while the saw is not running, so any adjustments we make, turn the saw off. That's the same with the joiner and all the other ones. While the long stock sometimes cross-cut, the table saw, make sure that you don't use both together. Could be a hazard, good. Let's see. Wear nonsense footwear, again, kind of keep the blade sharp, good. Still work. Okay, I think we're just about done here. I'm just making sure I didn't forget something myself. Okay. We're kind of going through actually how to cut here, so that'll be in the PowerPoint, and I'll show you how that goes here in just a second. All right, and different blades. Now, we don't have to worry about different blades because we use one blade in here that's universal, so we're set. Okay? All right, a few ways to actually measure, so you can bring the camera in a little bit. Guys, step up here. I want you to see this done. Actually, go around the back side here. Go around the back side so you can see this process. Okay, what we want to do on this table saw is, number one, we want to make sure if we're making a cross cut, we're using the miter gauge, right? We talked about that with the bandsaw yesterday. So we make a cross cut, we want to make sure that this is square. Okay, and when I say square, I mean square to the blade itself. Okay. The other thing is we want to, since this table saw actually puts the blade at a bevel, we want to make sure if we're making a 90-degree cut that our saw blade is also straight. All right. So there's a couple of different ways to measure this. To make sure the blade is square itself, we wheel it all the way up. Go ahead and wheel it all the way up, Tessa. Okay. She's actually going to be putting a measuring device right next to the blade itself. That's good enough. So one of you guys go over and, hold on. Go over and put the saw at 0 state energy. Can you reach up that high? Okay, thank you. All right, she's going to put the square, our carpenter square, or our woodshop square, right against the blade. She's going to check for any light in between the blade and the square itself. If there's not, then we do not have to adjust that hand wheel on the right hand side of the machine, right? For our bevel. So we should be set. Okay. Now, the second thing she's going to do, she's going to take the miter gauge. She's going to slide it in these two slots here on the table for the miter gauge. And yes, you can cut with the miter gauge either on the right or left side. Okay. She slide that in there. She's going to put the butt of the square against the miter gauge. She's going to slide it against the blade. Okay. And if we see no light in between, which we don't, she's kind of on some of the teeth, so we'll see just a little bit, which is fine. As long as it looks like an even amount of light in there, or there's no light, all right, that means our miter gauge is nice and square. Now, sometimes what I tend to do, just because, you know, I get in the motion of working, okay, I always remember that the edge of the table saw is straight, right? This is a cast piece of metal, and this should most definitely be straight. If not, you can always put a square on here and measure that too. But what we can do is we can actually slide the miter gauge back, and we can go off one of the lines for the table itself, and you loosen up this handle on top, and you can turn the miter gauge to be straight with that line too. Tighten it back down. Okay, so there's a few different ways to straighten this stuff up. All right? So measuring to make sure we're straight. Okay, now, what I talked about before is I talked about the measurement that we can make for our board between the blade and the rip fence for making a cross cut, or a rip cut. All right. We could use that measuring device that's in front of the rip fence itself, or our best way is, and Tessa's going to show you how this works. Show where the red dot. Okay. What she's going to do is she's going to show you the red dot and set it at 4 inches. Okay. And that should be about 4 inches when it's set there. Okay. Now typically we'd have our blade down a little bit, but it's okay where it's at for now. Alright, so this should measure 4 inches with this little red dot here in the center of this plastic piece, with the 4 right below it, on that measuring strip on the fence. Time will you ring? 20. Couple minutes. Alright. The best way to do this, and I feel, is I always take a tape measure, right? We see 4 inches here on the tape measure. Now, if we actually take and we follow that device there on the fence itself, what it's doing is it's measuring us 4 inches from the rip fence itself and the outside of the blade. If we want a piece cut to 4 inches, we need it to measure between the fence and the inside of the blade. Okay, so usually when you're making your measurements, you always want to take into account that there is about an 1/8 inch that the saw will turn into sawdust. Okay, the saw blade itself will turn into sawdust. So we want to take that in consideration. And we actually want to set the fence, if we're going to use the measuring device on the fence itself, about 1/8 of an inch long, right? Okay. I'm going to tell you in the safety video that we actually want to use a tape measure. Go ahead. We want to use a tape measure always to double check to make sure our measurement's right. If we don't, we can waste a piece of lumber, and that's not a good thing because it's fairly expensive. All right. So here we're set definitely at 4 inches. Now, Tessa already knows this issue. When we unlock the rip fence, it tends to want to kind of kink sideways. So when you initially put the lock mechanism down, it'll move it back into straightness, okay? And then you want to remeasure again. At this point, she's measured. We're 4 inches. We're set to go. Okay? Now, next time we come back to this saw, what we're going to do is Tessa's going to actually demonstrate to us how to send the board through this. The safety standing to the side, making sure we make a nice rip cut. If we have time, we'll also do a cross cut, and we'll go from there. Okay?